hosted by the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit at Xavier University of Louisiana. My name is Dr. David Robinson Morris, and I'm the founding director of the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit, and I'll be your moderator for today. Let me tell you a bit about the center. The Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit was founded in August of 2018 as a response to our calling as the nation's only Black and Catholic institution of higher learning. And just one way we at Xavier put our knowledge into practice toward the creation of a more just and humane society. Focusing our efforts on crystallizing community, research, and activism within the areas of educational equity, criminal justice reform, and environmental justice, the center serves as a present point of intersection that brings together 95 years of our history at Xavier, working to combat and dismantle oppressive systems, triumphing in the face of adversity, reclaiming our shared humanity, and educating human beings who go out into the world ready to do justice always and in all ways. Today's panel is another glimpse of what we attempt to do to inform and galvanize while impacting policy, changing practice, and most especially uplifting the human spirit. Before I allow each of our guests to introduce themselves, thirdly, let me situate today's conversation. And as a note, you may find their bios at our website, www.zula.edu/Center for Equity Justice. Alice Walker wrote, quote, "To acknowledge our ancestors means we are aware that we did not make ourselves, that the line stretches all the way back, perhaps to God or to gods. We remember them because it is an easy thing to forget. It's easy to forget that we are not the first to suffer, we're not the first to rebel, we're not the first to fight, we're not the first to love, and we're definitely not the first to die. The grace with which we embrace life, in spite of the pain, in spite of the sorrow, is always a measure of what has gone before us," end quote. Today is Juneteenth. It's very fitting that I am at home in my hometown of Galveston, where the celebration of Juneteenth originated, and where I grew up celebrating this day with a community parade and family barbecues and a recounting of both the joy of this day and what had to have been the wound of the enslaved to learn on June 19th, 1865, over 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, that Lincoln had freed the slaves, had freed the enslaved people, and that they indeed were free. 155 years ago, Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston to announce from Ashton Villa that the Civil War had ended. The Union Army was victorious, and the enslaved were declared free. I imagine the joy the ancestors must have felt on that day, only to be pierced with the reality of the very slow work of transforming word into deed, of law into lived reality. And still today, we are struggling for the realization of the idea of America and the practice of freedom. Nevertheless, they and we persist. Through the brutality of white terror and the lynching of Black bodies, Jim Crow, police states, economic inequity, the Great Migration, the struggle and promise of the Civil Rights Movement, and even the election of the first Black man as president of these United States, Black people and others who are marginalized have witnessed the idea of America undulate. Or as my grandmother would remark, for every step we take toward progress, toward equality and the realization of the idea of America, they knock us back 2 steps. But we know that nothing beats a failure but a try. And if we keep trying, we'll surely win. As I wrote to my colleagues on this panel today, an invitation for today's discussion. The murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and now, unfortunately, we can add to those names the murders of Rayshard Brooks, Jamel Floyd, the lynchings of 4 Black men, the murder of 2 Black trans women of color, the murder of a Black Lives activist in Florida. These murders and the graphic public exposure of these murders, in conjunction with the devastating impact of COVID-19 on Black and marginalized communities, have driven many of us very quickly from despair to outrage. Imani Perry writes in Breathe, a letter to my sons. She writes, and she counsels her sons to witness both the joy and the wounds of living, breathing, and being Black and male in America. For most of us, the wounds outweigh the joy, but the joy is not to be made a crumb. The joy fuels us. It aids us in healing the wounds and catalyzing new hope. The joy itself is resistance, but so too is the righteous rage. And boy, do I have a lot of it. A lot of it. What has been made crystal clear over the last few months, and indeed the last few weeks, is that we have much, much work to do. We have work to do on ourselves, within our respective communities, in the city, in the state, and indeed the nation. Fueled by poor national leadership, and that's being polite. Black murders at the hands of law enforcement and a growing racist rhetoric exacerbated by COVID-19's disproportionate impact on Black and marginalized communities. We are witnessing the righteous rage of the oppressed spill over into the streets. And what I hope is the destruction of the lie of white supremacy and the dismantling of oppressive systems, a complete transformation of our culture. And it sure is time for one. With that, I invite each of us into conversation to begin to analyze what is occurring in our country with respect to race relations, to discuss the legal, historical, socio-political issues that remain ever present, and meaningfully consider ways that we might move toward collective transformation. As you guessed it, in today's conversation, we will touch on the need for collective grand reimagining of justice, the abolition of systems that no longer, and I might argue, never have served us well. We'll dialogue about the need to combat hate and the lie of white supremacy, and how each of our guests are working to uphold the dignity and personhood of individuals and the collective in this country. My overarching question, the question I assume the ancestors had in 1863, and indeed on June 19th, 1865. What does it mean to be free? What is freedom? Surely freedom is not the constant struggle against a white knee on a Black neck. And with that, I'll invite our panelists to introduce themselves to the viewing audience and to tell us about the work that they're doing and what keeps them going. Thank you and welcome.
I'm happy to start if others are okay with that.
Please.
David, your words are so poignant, and I intended not to be emotional before I began my remarks, but I just can't help myself. It's so significant that your hometown is Galveston. When I hear you speak, I hear the voices of our ancestors. I really do. And you are our ancestors' wildest dreams in many respects. Folks know me on the phone. Sometimes I have a hard time introducing myself. I am the executive director of the ACLU of Louisiana. My name is Alana. And I am coming to you today less in that role as executive director, more as a Black woman, as a Black mother, And as someone who has attempted to dedicate her resources and energy and strength and time into making the promise of this country real for people that look like me and like my baby. As y'all know, the ACLU of Louisiana is in some ways a time-honored organization, over 100 years old this year. And it is the nation's chief defender of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. What does it mean, though, to be an organization that is 100 years old in today's society? And what it means to me is that this organization that is dedicated to civil rights and civil liberties and upholding them was formed and constructed in a time in our nation where Black people were still considered 3/5 of a person. And so for me, the work of civil rights and civil liberties as articulated through the ACLU has been to refract the work of defending justice through the lens of racial and gender justice, always. We know that the nation's original sin was slavery, but we know that that manifestation of injustice simply evolved through time. It evolved into Jim Crow, it evolved into mass incarceration, and it has continued to evolve and have tentacles that move in every single aspect of our society. And so when we think about what we have to do to dismantle that, it begins with a simple premise. In many ways, it begins with a recognition that this country and what it is built on has been the backs and sweat and tears of Black women, Black men, and Black children. And that sweat equity never turned out to be any return on investment for our people. Never. Not to this day. That the erasure that has gone on in this nation to remove and sanitize and censor our significance, our integral significance to the birth and development of this nation, scars us so deeply and impacts everything that we do. Why do Black Lives Matter? Why do we scream Black Lives Matter? Why do we chant Black Lives Matter in the streets? Because in 1776, again, we were 3/5 of a person. 100 years later, we were passing laws to determine whether Black people could be commodity, whether we could be bought and sold. 100 years later, we are still pressing for freedom and liberation from systems of oppression like mass incarceration and police violence. Black Lives Matter is a mere, it's such a basic statement. It is a basic statement that reflects the idea that Black lives have been in danger from the beginning of this nation's founding and continue to be in great danger. And this call to our community is simply to speak the words that we are here, that there is nothing that is wrong with Black people that racism can't fix, that ending racism can't fix. And to have your voices raised with ours to say that we will wait no more. We will not wait another day to vindicate this truth. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. I'm ready to take to the street.
Let's go.
Aaron, would you like to follow that?
If I say no, do I have to? Alana, those are very powerful words. And David, thank you for entrusting me in this conversation. And I want to start by saying that my own work in this space about who I am and how I engage in these conversations is not complete. And I'm still learning and working and listening. And so I ask your forgiveness on this conversation if some of my lack of polish comes through in some of these conversation spaces. I'm the regional director of the Anti-Defamation League South Central region. My responsibilities are for the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. The ADL is a 107-year-old organization, so we have ACLU beat by a couple years. And our mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. And what that has evolved to be is that we are an anti-hate organization where our mission is to combat hate, bigotry, bias in any form that it manifests. And ultimately, we believe that no vulnerable community is safe until all vulnerable and marginalized communities are safe. So our mission is to uplift spaces that, whether it's our Black and brown brothers and sisters, whether it is our LGBTQ partners, whether it is in immigration spaces, whatever those spaces look like for marginalized communities, ADL's mission is to go in and work to advocate and ally and protect those communities. One of the ways that we have found our critical space is in driving hate crime prevention and hate crime laws to protect individuals and communities who are targeted. We were the driving force behind the Federal Hate Crime Prevention Act that was finally passed in 2009 after 13 attempts and decades of effort and hundreds of partners. We were finally able to get it attached in I believe in a transportation act or some kind of mass omnibus bill, because we could not get it through. But what it shows is that nothing that we're going to talk about today is a snap of the finger fix. This is it's 400 plus years in the making, and it's going to take concerted coalition conversations about how we make the fixes intentionally and intelligently in the coming future, that this is not something that we can knee-jerk fix, that we work collaboratively together in spaces of reform. And it's something that I'm very excited and willing and able to participate in, and I look forward to doing that. I'll step back because we have other great panelists and my voice doesn't need to be the leading voice. So thank you again, David, for having me.
Thank you, Aaron. Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you, David. Happy Juneteenth to everyone. My name is Dr. Nicholas Mitchell. I am the Policy and Research Fellow specializing in race and racism at the Jesuit Social Research Institute at Loyola University. Our areas are poverty, migration, and racism. We are a advocacy institute. We do engage in public policy advocacy, but also in a lot of education. So I've been there since 2016, so which has been a very active time regarding racism in the public sphere. And the way I situate myself in this work is I was born in 1982, 37 years old. I am among the first generation of African Americans born in the United States into neither slavery nor Jim Crow oppression. And the way I situate all my work is that we are only truly, and depends how you want to mark it, 52 years, if you go like 1968, about 52 years removed from the end of Jim Crow. I'm pretty sure we could stretch that into the 70s, depending on when your city decided to act right. And we have to keep that in mind. So officially, with the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, 1968, the United States has only been a liberal democracy for 52 years. We often ignore that. And when we have this massive span of time in which we often, we view America as, we've been a liberal democracy for 200 years, that is categorically false. So, and that often becomes the work, because the way America was structured was to be this very, and there are many different ways you can put it, a race-based society, a caste-based society. You can almost call, Jim Crow governments were quasi-fascist governments unto themselves. I mean, they were so serious with their racism that the Nazis, when they wanted to write the Nuremberg laws, they came and looked at the United States. So that really frames the work of we have to really scoop out how embedded all these racist policies and systems are, but also in the culture. Because we still have many millions of Americans who were born into and grew up in these very race-based societies where white privilege was legally enshrined and Black suffering was very much a public policy goal. And so that's really where I situate my work. I do a lot of criminal justice work, a lot of education work. Really, one of my major focuses is education, because that is often where, if you want to talk about anything from the lost cause to this deification of the Confederacy, to the beginnings of desegregation itself, you really have to talk about education. And David, you mentioned earlier, like, what does it mean to be free? And I'm struggling to answer that, but I can think of it in aspects. I believe that one of the measurements of being free are when Black parents no longer have to give their children the talk of how to survive an encounter with the police. And it's not a guarantee. It just maybe increases your chances. And a lot of us as Black girls and Black boys, we got that talk before we even learned how to drive. Some of us got that talk, depending where we grew up, as early as, pre-K and kindergarten. So what does all that mean? I think we can say that Black people are gaining freedom when we no longer have to curtail our children's childhoods with the ominous nature of what it is to be Black in America. I think there's been clear progress since the end of Jim Crow. Absolutely. First Black president, a lot of large scale integration. I think these protests are really also testament of that. But we still have a long way to go. It's not contradictory to acknowledge progress has been made and progress is needed. And, that's the nature of the work I do. And I'm really, really glad that you pulled this panel together. And I've worked with everyone on this panel, and I highly respect all of you.
Thank you, Nick. Professor Quigley.
Forget to unmute in our Zoom life. So I'm Bill Quigley. I work at Loyola Law School, and I have been a social justice lawyer for 40 plus years. And a lot of that work has been civil rights work. But I would start sort of where Aaron starts, is that as a white male who's in his 70s, who spent the first 15, 18 years of my life under totally legal segregation, that have to understand how little I know and how little I have understood. I have a lot of friends who have helped me understand something and taught me and coached me and cursed me and encouraged me, but I'm still a product of my, how I grew up. So being a white person involved in civil rights work and social justice work and liberation work and police brutality work and environmental racism, death penalty, everything, there's just no end to what we need to learn. And I really appreciate this opportunity because I've already learned a lot in the last 25 minutes. I really have, so thank you. I think, what the idea of a white knee on a black neck, I think just crystallizes actually most of our institutions for all of my conscious life. And unfortunately, still today. And so much today that police officers can do that knowing they're being filmed, do it knowing people are yelling at them to stop, and other police officers standing around making sure that they have the right to do it. Those police officers did it because that's what they're asked to do. I mean, you know, we see that now with the police officers walking out saying, you're not defending our brothers out there because we're only doing what you're telling us to do. We are the people that society, you know, this is our mission. And the idea of dismantling white supremacy, for a long time, I thought as a person that it was about civil rights for African Americans. Mm. And then through a lot of people teaching me is trying to remember that the only way that there are civil rights for everybody is that some people have to have their privileges reduced and dismantle the systems that we have right now that support the unjust status quo that we have in every single institution that we're in, including all the ones that I participate in law, in education, in church, in all of our professions, and in every institution. So I approach that with humility, and I approach it as hopefully a person who has something to offer, but also has a lot to learn. And so the idea of liberation that Alana brought up, I think is so key, because there is this, I grew up, I studied to be a priest for a while, and I was very much into voice for the voiceless and helping the oppressed and that sort of stuff, and I got that. But then I was finally taught that there aren't any voiceless people. And it's actually that the voice, you know, we say voice for the people who society says are voiceless don't want us to speak for them. They want us to shut everybody up enough so that their voices can be heard, because they have something to say and they've been saying it. It's just that people haven't listened. So there is, I think, for all of us, certainly for white people who are involved in liberation struggles, there is a real fear of, a realistic fear of getting into the savior complex, that sort of stuff. And the best sort of quote that I've seen about that is one that's probably familiar to most of the people who are watching, I'm sure familiar to you all, is the one that's on the, was on the Aboriginal Community Center in Australia, the indigenous people in Australia, who said, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. And when I saw that sign the very first time, I was actually infuriated by it, because I defined myself. My self-image was that I was a helper. And for somebody to say, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time, was just a slap in the face for what I thought I was doing. But the rest of the sign was, but if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us struggle together. Then that makes sense, because my liberation as an Irish Catholic white male with all the privileges that come with that, I need the liberation that comes with the fairness and equality and equity, with the dismantling of these institutions of white supremacy, and so that we really are in a place where justice will prevail for all of us. And that we can't have liberation without justice, and we can't have civil rights without actually just rights for white people, which means less rights and less privileges and less advantages that are built into our systems. And the final thing I would say is this, is that as white people, you know, it's easy not to see white supremacy because it works for us, right? And so we sort of think that's, you know, that's our own accomplishment. It's our own sort of hard work, et cetera, instead of realizing that it is the electricity that flows through the walls, that's hidden behind the ceiling and that sort of stuff, that the system is wired this way. And in order to transform it, we have to rewire it. And that's what dismantling white supremacy is. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion with you and the rest of the people.
Thank you, Bill, so much. I want to remind our audience that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you have questions for our panelists today. Bill, you said something very interesting, right? Your point about needing to unlearn is key, right? About white folks needing to unlearn certain things is key. But you also said that there could be no liberation without justice, right? And we're seeing folks take to the streets for justice. And it's very fitting on Juneteenth that my first sort of formal question to you all is about abolition, right? And about the demonstrations against the racial injustice and police misconduct that is continuing to proliferate across this country. There has been, as we know, a renewed call to defund the police, to abolish the police, to abolish prisons, to abolish ICE, toward a reimagining of a transformative justice, right? There's so many terms, so many phrases. I'm confused by most of them, and I read this stuff every day, right? And there is no common language, there seems. Let's talk about what that means in terms of policy, in terms of reallocation of tax dollars. What does that mean in terms of culture? And are these institutions necessary? If anybody wants to tackle that.
I'm happy to start to try. One thing I wanted to say is I didn't get a chance to share about the definition of freedom, and I don't have my own definition that I am particularly fond of, but Isabel Wilkerson shared one that I think is really powerful that I wanted to share with folks. Freedom would be for African American people to be able to choose what they would do with their God-given talents. To choose what they would do with their God-given talents. That really resonates with me because, as we've spoken about from the early admonishments that we receive as babies to restrain ourselves, to protect ourselves, the ways that our Black culture has evolved, where you may hear parents or grandparents say, I have to hurt him before the world will hurt him. So this idea of breaking us in a way so that when the world tries to break us, we don't completely fall apart. So just this ability to be able to be exactly who God called us to be in every manifestation of that is freedom. And how do we seek out freedom? And how do we dismantle systems that are in essentially standing in direct antithesis to freedom? So when you talk about defunding the police or divestment, you'll hear a lot of terms to describe what this means. Is I think what it really centers on is thinking about our budgets, whether they be local, state, or federal, and looking at policy, whether it be local, state, or federal, looking at legislation, whether it be local, state, or federal, and thinking about that budget, that legislation as a moral document. How do we evidence and live into the core values articulated in our Constitution? And how do we fund them? Do we continue to live into the myth of the American dream without manifesting the resources that it takes to make that dream a reality? If a budget is a moral document, and if we must have the moral clarity to articulate what those line items look like, how do they evidence justice? How do they evidence freedom? How do they evidence liberation? I've been thinking about this and started to put some words together and writing about the idea of, it's very, very much a part of our historical context and understanding. You've heard people say, with regard to our liberation from British control, no taxation without representation. What did that mean? That meant that you can't, as an oppressor, you can't come and control me. You can't take and extract resources from me unless I am represented. Unless I am here, if I have a seat at the table and I can articulate what is right for me and how I want to live. And I've pushed that a little bit further to say, there should be no law without love. No law without love means don't legislate for me if you don't love me. Don't craft policies for me if you have never spoken to my community. Don't purport to have my best interest in mind, as Bill said, when you don't want to be in struggle with me. See, dissent is not about hatred. It is about love. We are raising our voices now in dissent and in resistance out of a deep love for this country and who she must become. And our laws, policies, practices must mirror that. They must mirror the inherent dignity of our people, all of our people. And so when we talk about divesting, what we're really saying is we want to reduce investment in things that don't support our people, and we want to increase investment in things that do. If we want to make this dream real, we have to vote our conscience, and we have to use our resources to be supportive of those goals. That's really all it is. It's very simple. Very simple. And so don't be confused by the controversy. Don't be confused, because we don't need police officers responding to people in mental health crisis. We don't need police officers responding with weapons for folks experiencing houselessness and homelessness. We don't need officers on proactive patrol with guns in places where we are trying to experience culture and community. That is all we're saying. We need those resources elsewhere. We need them in our schools. We need them in our churches. We need them in our playgrounds. We need them in our court system. That's all we're saying. A budget is a moral document. Let's treat it as such.
If I might jump in after those powerful words, I just want to point out there's a couple things that I want to touch on. One is the critical. There's an obvious and critical need to re-examine and change the systems that are in place, whether it be through law enforcement, whether it be through any number of systems that we may touch on today. The world in the United States is not. We are not in isolation. In our society, we can anticipate in this effort substantial pushback. One of the concerns that I have is the lack of definitional clarity that you just raised in this question creates vulnerability in the opportunity for effective counterattack by fear-mongering, by divisiveness, and going into words that are being elevated that are not necessarily all-encompassing or reflective of the needs that Alana just so eloquently articulated. And at ADL, we are acutely aware of divisiveness and fear-mongering as tactics to sow discord and create vulnerability in our society. So from a space where we can anticipate pushback, that is a deep concern of mine. And the other point that I just want to touch on is that in these conversations, in the discussions around what policing, what law enforcement should and can look like, there are very real bad guys out there. There are people who have organizations, and ideologies that look at what's happening today as an opportunity to go in and sow discord, to amplify chaos, to amplify violence, who wish nothing but ill upon the people who are raising their voices to call attention to the need for change. We need to make sure that we maintain the capacity to protect our communities from those who wish us harm and wish us ill. And there is an intersection in this conversation that I don't have the answer to at this moment, but that can't be something that is ignored, because there are very, very much people out there who wish ill and harm upon those people raising their voices right now, and would effectively want to deconstruct our entire system in a way that is not consistent with this conversation. So I just want to point that out as well.
Let me jump in. Well, I think when we get to, what do all these terms mean, defund police, abolish police, I think the first thing we do have to recognize is how really social media has changed the political landscape of a great many things, including activism and community organizing. It really democratized it. So, I mean, defund police, abolish ICE, all of that really rises off of social media, which is within the confines of social media. And I mean, that's just the way it is. I'm all here for it, very much, social media driven activism and awareness. But I think, when you look how people talk about it, I mean, these things are very, very, to what everyone else has said, these things are very, very well put together policy positions, and they're being informed by a lot of things. And I think, speaking, towards, kind of millennial, Generation Z, and, generation, Gen X's, and even baby boomers, for so long, we've watched the social services, human services budgets be slashed. And, people advocating against those slashings, and they're always told, well, go find the money. Okay, they found the money. They went to those police budgets and they found the money, as Representative Ocasio-Cortez very recently put on social media. And so what they're talking about is, and you even see, police officers, talking about like, they don't really feel that we're the people that need to be doing this. We're not the people that need to go, deal with somebody who may be overdosing or, or homelessness. That's not our job. But they've slashed all these other budgets, and they filtered some of that money to the police departments. They're being tasked with things that they're not trained for. And you're going to get problems from that. But I think another big reason that, because it's a very money-centric conversation, and I think because, I've always been taught, and I do think it's true, your words may be nice. Show me your budget. I'll tell you what you care about. And they're tired of, a lot of people just tired of being given all these words. But in the meantime, we're going to cut SNAP benefits. We're going to cut WIC. We're going to cut, money to help homelessness. We're not going to fund public defenders. So, we have these, these really good people representing way more cases than they can adequately do. So I think that is very much what fuels a lot of this. And I think, it is a fundamental truth. A budget is a moral document. And so you see a lot of municipal and statewide and federal morality being played out. But I think that, the language is, and the terms are loose and free flowing because it's happening in a space where the language and the information is very free flowing. It's all very organic. I think defund police, abolish ICE are very, very organic things. And I think for all of us who, are very much taught in our political advocacy, your messaging matters because it opens you up or closes you off to certain attack. I think we see it and we flinch a bit because we can see how they're going to be attacked. But I think to a lot of the grassroots peoples, really it's showing how keyed in they are. They respond to these really quick, and there's a lot of memes being shared that explain what all these things are in very, very good detail. So I think it's just real hard because, next week there may be another kind of short, concise term for this. But I mean, that's just the nature of what's going on right now.
Go ahead, Bill.
This is Bill. My thoughts, most people have said a couple of things though. I think defund the police is a reflection. The police are just the cutting edge of this gigantic institution, the criminal legal system, which the police, if I was a police officer, you know, I mean, I can understand them saying, look, who changed the rules? This is what I've been asked to do, tasked to do. And so I think it is defund the police. A couple of things. One is we all have a human right to be safe. And we have a human right to be able to protect ourselves and our families and that. So I think we got to start by rejecting this false choice between we either have police or we're safe. We either have the prisons or we're safe. We either have parole and probation, which is millions and millions of people, or we're safe. And I think what people are saying, look, this is not safe. This system is not making us safe. This system is making our situation, our neighborhoods, our children, it's making it much more dangerous, particularly to people of color, but also to low-income white people and that. And so the idea is, I think, a deconstruction of the entire system. And I would, for those who are watching, this group Critical Resistance for decades has been talking about abolishing prisons. And if the police are only, their main job is to do things that create this pipeline to bring it into the entire system. And so we have to reject the false choice, but we can't, I think, just pick on the police. I'm totally for defunding the police, reducing the funding, doing it. But look at all the judges we have. Look at all the jails that we have. Look at all the various, in the state of Louisiana, we have 64 parishes, but we have hundreds of different law enforcement agencies. We have 64 parishes, but we have hundreds of jails in this state. We don't need all these jails. We don't need all these prisons. We don't need that. What we do need is healthcare. What we do need is education. We need these opportunities because our society has made a choice that a certain colored child at a certain color of child who gets to a certain place in their education that we have decided they are not keepable anymore. We're just not going to keep them and they're not worthy of continuing. So we're going to shunt them off to this other institution that is thriving. And so I say the defund the police, absolutely, but don't do it out of just the police because it has to be the entire system that we're talking about. And I would reclaim this idea of radical transformation. That the idea, that people are saying, well, these kids that are out there protesting, they're all radicals. Radical is a great thing. Radical is going back to the root in the Latin analysis. What is the root? The root is that we want to be safe. Has this system made us more safe? I think the answer is no. So to get to transform it, we have to radically restructure it. And that is not just the police. It is not just the sheriffs. It's not just the jails. It's the entire system that needs to be radically transformed because we have a right to be safe. And this is not making us safe.
Yeah. So you all bring up, so in my formal study is Ubuntu and socially engaged Buddhism, right? And Thich Nhat Hanh says that words get sick and we need to heal them, right? So we talk about love, we talk about defunding, those words are sick, right? We don't know what they mean anymore. Like we don't know what radical means, right? Radical just means to grasp the root of the thing. The other thing that strikes me in this conversation is also from Thich Nhat Hanh. He says, we don't fight wars against men. We fight wars against ideologies, right? We're actually fighting ideological wars. And this notion of deconstructing a system is really about eradicating or transforming a grand narrative, an ideology. And I think the question that all of us have is, how the hell do we do that, right? I know it's slow, deliberate, systematic work, but how do we do it?
I think if you're going to try to change ideologies, I think that's really a cultural thing because, you can change the systemic nature of an institution, but the culture that produced that institution, the ideologies that really led to it, they will very much resist you, and given the opportunity, they will reassert themselves. So I think, I mean, the only way that you can really change an ideology is you have to confront the ideology, and you have to confront it often on its own terms. I think, often we have a clash of ideologies, but I believe that the ideology that understands the other, the ideology it's fighting against, and I'm saying ideology a lot, is the one that usually wins, because I think true understanding is understanding how something justifies it unto itself. And also, can you get to the essence of what this ideology is about? And racism is an ideology. I mean, you can almost, it's a construct that really unto itself makes no sense. But you have to sometimes you have to understand what is the objective of the ideology. So to me, the objective of racism is to be able to brutalize another person and ignore their screams as you do it. That is always the bare bones of how racism works, because a child cries the same in every language. So how do we distance ourselves and able to do this? Well, we come up with this really fanciful idea of race. So how do we challenge race and racist ideologies? I think really through social justice, and anti-racism, a genuinely different view, because I think what becomes important is you have to provide people an alternative way. You just can't tear down, you just can't tear down the institutions of white supremacy and walk away, because you're going to leave white supremacy there, and it will come back. If Reconstruction taught us anything, they will come back. So I think that's what you have to do. You have to provide people a better way, and you have to. I mean, this is really hard work. Sometimes it's dangerous. So I think that's where we begin. To change this culture is to be unapologetic in our social justice, unapologetic in our anti-racism, and unapologetic in our commitment to, not just diversity and inclusion, but reimagining what the relationship between the races should be. We need racial reconciliation at this point. So yeah, I think it's very possible to overcome ideology. We've seen it before, but it's hard.
Could I chime in after Nick there?
Go ahead, Aaron. I see you itching to get in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I could, my face could come through the screen, it would. No. To build off what Nick was saying, one of the things, and what's really resonated with what Bill just said, is that at moments in time, our society has monetized systems that had been hugely detrimental. The military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, and now what we're seeing is the monetizing of polarization in social media spaces, and how the narratives which we're subjected to are effectively counter narratives depending on what space you belong in. And this hyper polarization that we find ourselves in as a society, and the normalizing pressures that we see exacerbating that divisiveness. From an ADL perspective, we're always concerned about normalization of othering, normalization of marginalizing. What we effectively have is a system in a structured society right now that's almost two realities. And bridging the gap between those two islands is going to be where this succeeds or fails. And, in my mind, ultimately, this is a conversation that eventually has to become about healing. And to heal, there's going to have to be a way to dialogue and reach out and start bridging that divide as a society, because we can't just heal one half of our society. We can't just have one half of of our nation do the necessary work to raise the necessary questions. It won't work if only half of us are committed to this fix. So ultimately, we're going to have to figure out ways to start diminishing the profit incentive to polarize us. And we work in that space a lot. But for this specific conversation, I see that as being one of the greatest impediments that we're going to need to get over. And ultimately, the question is, how do we use this moment as a healing moment societally? And I don't know that we're there yet. But ultimately, I think that's where this needs to go. And I would just say my concern is about those two realities that seem to exist in this polar space we find ourselves in.
Yeah, so there is, we have an audience question. It's Tracy Washington. She says, hello, everyone. And Tracy's question or comment is that she worries that we won't get it right this time around, right? We have seen the cycles of this, and that she's worried we won't get it right this time around, and that if we fail to dismantle those systems, what do we do? And she says, unfortunately, I cannot control changing the institutionalized racism where these institutions are controlled by whites. We will see rage, which, if it leads to a revolution, is not bad. I'm just not sure this post-Jim Crow generation really understands there can be full revolution. She asked the panel to talk her down from this, from this thought.
Wow. Yeah, so I just want to say, Tracy's one of our godmothers of the revolution. So we should all really listen closely to her skepticism, and I think take heed to it, because she has really borne witness to times of revolution and then times of retrenchment. Mm-hmm. And the way that our history works in terms of the pendulum swinging forward and then immediately swinging back. And we had others on the panel talk about Reconstruction as an example of this. And so I think Tracy's right to be skeptical, and she's right to question whether or not, I think, folks like me and others have strengthened our backs enough to really understand what this is going to take. Mm. I think in response to your last question about how do we do this, I think the way Thich Nhat Hanh expressed the idea around developing communities of resistance is really important. And I think we have to, especially us folks who are wielding some power in this structure, because I think that's what we also have to recognize. There's not just white folks who have power in this system. There are Black power brokers too, who are wielding this power and using the system, not for the liberation of Black people, but for self and for other motives, for profit motives. And so none of us are immune from this. And it takes a very sobering look at ego and at self and at the system as a whole to examine what parts we're playing in it. And so I think one of the things that I'm starting to do, and I think, organizationally, what we're doing even just tomorrow, is that in terms of building a new generation of radicals, we have to start with our babies. So tomorrow we're going to do a March for Racial Justice for Children, and we're starting at age 3 to 13. We want to normalize the joy and abundance and beauty of the phrase Black Lives Matter. We want to center the voices of Black youth and help empower allies to do the same. We want to give our children a framework to understand what is happening to them. and how they have power to change it. And it really starts just that early. And so I really don't have an answer for this. And perhaps there isn't a singular answer, except to say that we can't give up. We have got to start in the same ways that Bill talked about racism being kind of like this metaphor for electricity. Shutting down that circuit breaker and rewiring society really starts with rewiring our babies. And then also creating this environment where they actually have the freedom to be who God called them to be, and working in the ways that we can to create those systems. Yes. Look at me. I see you.
Now, I think that I think you're spot on with that, and I think to Tracy's question, building this new class of radicals, this new generation of radicals, is going to take a lot of work. It's heavy lifting, right? We have another audience member who asks, "Why now?" Right? And how do we make this movement, this moment, into a movement? So as I was driving home, I was listening to NPR's Code Switch podcast, and they had a segment called "A Decade of Watching Black People Die." And they spoke with Jamil Smith, who's the current senior writer at the Rolling Stone magazine. He wrote an essay 5 years ago that was titled, "What Does Seeing Black Men Die Do For You?" Right? And he recalls 5 years ago, Rodney King, which was his generation, right, of watching that on television over and over again. He recalls the murders of Walter Scott, of Michael Slager, of Eric Garner. The list goes on and on. Our own Tatiana Jefferson, who was a Xavier, Breonna Taylor. These later killings, these later murders, some of them did not emit the same reaction as the murder of George Floyd, right? And so the question is, why now? What is it about this death? What is it about this murder that has caused us to really get off our asses and take to the streets and get some work done?
Well, I think, and I may be entirely wrong about this, one thing I do think is that the George Floyd, you know, you want to call it a murder, you can, it really is a lynching, in my opinion, really parallels in the response that Emmett Till's lynching had, and galvanizing, because, you know, right after, you know, Emmett Till's funeral and the court cases, that's when, you know, the Montgomery bus boycott kicks off in December. I think why now? It's a mixture of a lot of things. I think the COVID, having so many people at home, they saw all of the videos of all of these murders, and they couldn't escape from it. There's really no escape. You know, you can't really busy yourself, you know, and I'm talking about like folks who are not, you know, who have the privilege of working from home. But I think what really got a lot of people by Floyd, and it really would hit me, was he calls for God, and then he calls for his mother. That he is in such writhing pain that he is calling for, and you can almost say they're synonymous. He's calling for someone that will come and protect him.
Yes.
And I think the officer, I mean, I guess had he had a look of rage on his face, that would have been something. But he was just completely just blasé about it. You're killing this man, and it's routine for you. And I think that was so much of a shock to a lot of people, that's what, you know, these things are organic. It's kind of hard to say which one's going to trigger it. But I think, you know, a decade of watching Black people just be murdered, you know, Black men and boys, you know, Tamir Rice, and girls and women just be murdered on camera, because the camera phone is an extremely powerful instrument. because has it not be for these, we wouldn't, we wouldn't know what would happen. The story would have been the story, eyewitnesses' testimonies, but you have this camera showing you exactly what happened. And I just think that all of these things meeting, the decade of black people, I think, even going back to Charlottesville, ever since Charlottesville, just this tension and where society is going, and this hyper awareness of white supremacy has been very much in the public, just in the mind, and it comes forward and it goes back. And I just think for some odd reason, and I think it's just because of the visceralness of it, like all murders, are visceral, but just there was something I just think that struck a chord with even, across the political spectrum. It didn't, you saw people from the left to the right, the libertarians, all of those talking about this was wrong. And I think it was like something broke in the collective consciousness, and a whole bunch of people finally saw what black people have been talking about for all this time. And then it went around the world. And you see all these people in Europe and in Asia and Africa recognizing this. So I don't think, maybe it won't be maybe for decades that we can finally put together the deep quantitative and qualitative study as to what triggered this. But I mean, it definitely, I think, it's on that level of, of Emmett Till and, and Michael Brown. And I think you can just look at how impactful this has been on the culture. We are not the same country we were a month ago. This is an entirely different, this is a new creature. And will it last? I hope so. Will this awareness and this commitment to social justice last? I really hope so. But none of us can say.
If I might build off of what Nick was saying, I think we also were arriving in a perfect storm moment. The horrific video of Ahmaud Arbery was only a week or two released. It was clear and obvious through COVID the incredible discrepancies of outcome and disparities that different communities, especially the Black community, were experiencing. We have elected officials across the country who have defined themselves by showing a complete lack of empathy or capacity to reach out in moments of pain and suffering with any semblance of humanity. And in those spaces, we're also, I was talking about polarization and divisiveness, the language of the day is the language of anger and outrage. And that has been cultivated for much of the past several years. The narrative that we are exposed to in public space, especially from top down, is through a lens of anger and kind of aggression. And I think those are factors that also contribute to this moment being one where this is George Floyd was the straw, and that it finally broke. And if you look at I think those other factors though have to be taken into account. And the willingness to move towards rage is something that's been cultivated, and righteous rage, but something that's been cultivated for years now in our society.
So I'd like to just make a couple of comments. One, Tracy, has been such a great fighter for justice for so long. And also, as the mom, has really, sweated out the nights when her son was out, worried whether he was coming back, and is a great role model for all of us in terms of participation in all kinds of transformation. I worry a little bit about the focus on healing, honestly, and worry a little bit because we can't turn to healing until we have honestly faced up to, what needs to be healed. And I think particularly in the white community, there's time like, okay, well, it's time for healing. It's time to, it's time for peace, meaning peace and quiet, as opposed to peace that's built on justice. And I don't think that, I think there's a lot of people say, why everybody's so angry? And why, there's not a lot of people, but in the white community, people are saying, well, look, I saw what that police officer did. That is horrifying. But I don't understand why that has created so many problems across the country. And I'd go back, especially since it's Xavier. I have this Saint Augustine of Hippo. It's like the year 500 or something like that. He said this beautiful thing: hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and the courage to do something about it. And I think that is the real hopeful part of what's going on right now. We're seeing a lot of anger. We're also seeing a lot of courage, and we're seeing it in new people and young people, much younger people than we've seen for some time. There have been protests against police brutality in New Orleans for decades on a regular basis, with the people who've taken down NOLA, with Malcolm Suber, with lots of other people who've done this work for decades. Now when they have these things, there's 3,000, 4,000 people there. Whereas before, if you had 100, it was really an exciting time. I do think it is a very hopeful time, but it is a very dangerous time too. And the danger is, as we saw in New Mexico last week, that the action and the energy that's being brought out by the young people, primarily by the young people, is attracting the people who want to fight back, the people who want to take this opportunity to disrupt and to fan the flames of rage. And theirs is not a righteous anger. Theirs is just a destructive anger. And so I know in my own self that I have a tendency towards anger, and it has to be channeled. It has to be done right. And that's me doing it. And then we do that as a community. And, how does change comes about? It doesn't come about by one person being mad or one person making a great speech or any of these other things that the government, or the traditional narratives say. It comes about by movements of people who connect on a lot of different levels. I can't go through today without sharing this one little thing of, there's a group of people in St. James Parish this morning that I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to join this, because African-American group called Rise St. James. And what they wanted to do was to walk about a quarter of a mile into a cane field to be able to pray on Juneteenth at a cemetery that was discovered by archaeologists was on the Buena Vista plantation out there, identified initially as enslaved people's cemetery. And it's an African-American group, primarily women, as most social justice groups are, primarily older church women and the like who wanted to do this. This corporation, Formosa, wanted to crush these women not because they wanted to pray, but because they dared say, we don't want your plant in our neighborhood. And so they said, since you are opposed to us putting a $9 billion toxic plant in our neighborhood, we are going to stop you from going to visit the graves of people that likely are related to people in your community. And they fought and they fought and they fought, and they used law enforcement, which is what we're talking about, defund the police. They sent law enforcement to people's houses saying, you can't go out there or you're going to be arrested. We filed suit, we won the suit. They asked to be redone. Yesterday, they took it to the Court of Appeals, an 80-page thing, and they ultimately were stopped. But they also said, then you're going to have to give us the name of every single person who goes out there and prove that they belong to this group and all these other things, which is total supremacy issues. That, you don't have the right to visit your own ancestors. You don't have the right to do what they have already promised in public to people. And it's that anger and the courage to be willing to go ahead and do that, to do something about it, that is really, really hopeful. And that's where the change is going to come about. Not one great big change, but hundreds and hundreds of little changes that are happening in Shreveport, or happening in Opelousas, or happening in Baton Rouge, or happening in New Orleans, that we can make some changes. And the final thing I would say to you is this: the change that we make in New Orleans is not a change that's happening in Jefferson Parish. Okay? Jefferson Parish, for those who watching this thing, is, you know, just across the river or just across a canal. A group of people who had been protesting in New Orleans went to Jefferson Parish during the week to protest and dared to try to get up on the expressway and got in a tussle. There's a video out there that people can see of a man, African-American man, holding his hands up in his car. He turned the video on his car, and the police are saying, get out of the car, get out of the car. And he's saying, what did I do? What did I do? Tell me what I did. I'm not opening the door. You know, they're just at a protest against the police killing a man, and he's holding the thing up, and the police start smashing in his windows with a hammer to drag him out. And the first thing the police did was to grab his phone and delete the video. So there would not be a history of what happened. So that is not across the country or anything else. That is across the river. And that is just as much a reality as what happens in Orleans. They couldn't get away with that in Orleans because we do have some Black elected officials here, but in other places that still we have to fight against. The idea is to fight against that. And that is the real fight that we have, I think.
Wow, Bill. You've started us on our, that's powerful. You've started us on our descent, our move to land the conversation, and to talk about the victories and the joys, right? I think we could talk for 2 more hours. Let's be honest. There's a lot to talk about. We've discussed the wounds, right? And I promised that we would talk about the joy. And your quote from the saint about Hope having 2 daughters, I think it has 3, right? And the 3rd daughter is joy, right? It's not to be made a crumb. And I don't know if we could survive any of this without glimpses of joy. And so I want you all to tell me, what are the joys? What are the victories? Bill, you just shared a huge victory. That is huge, right? Talk to us about joy.
Let me do one final thing on that. Is that yesterday afternoon at 3 o'clock, we came out of court and an old white judge ruled in favor of this African-American community to have access to that thing. And it was a surprise, honestly. And when it came out, the women, was one guy in a wheelchair, and women came out and sang outside the courthouse. Victory is mine, that beautiful song, Victory is Mine. And the joy and the unexpected joy that the law and an institution that is used to oppress people left and right actually did the right thing. It shouldn't be a surprise, but it was a joy. And that joy continued today in the ceremony there.
Yeah. Thank you, Bill.
I think there's a piece that also dovetails with the litigation that Bill is speaking about, and our governor vetoing House Bill 197, which was a law that was passed through our legislature, but was actually manufactured by ALEC. And we probably know the histories of ALEC, but it is a white supremacist organization that seeks to create model laws that can be disseminated throughout the country, and they've done lots about mandatory minimums, which this was a mandatory minimum law, 3 strikes you're out in California, other harmful laws that have really destroyed Black and brown lives and many other lives in our criminal legal system. But the governor used his power, executive power, to veto a law that would have criminalized the right to protest of the very folks that Bill and his team were representing. And it boggled the mind that this could pass our legislature, but in the time of COVID, in the time of confusion that we're in, ALEC and others who seek to, as Aaron talks about, take advantage of this moment really snuck this law and several others, to be honest, past us. And so we really needed, we really needed the governor to do this, and we weren't clear that that would happen. And so that is absolutely a victory that should be celebrated for the people of St. John and St. James and the folks who have been advocating for environmental justice in this area for so long. Joy for me personally, I know that this has been an incredibly stressful time for so many of us. And I know that the simplest and plainest way that I can describe it is the way that I know that joy is real and God is real is when I look at my daughter. It is through when I'm able to kind of, when I'm not on a Zoom and when I'm not focused on trying to do the external work, the internal work really is about recognizing that the most important thing that I might do might not have anything to do with my actions. It might be in who I'm raising. And so my joy is really centered on being with her and experiencing life with her, because children, the beauty of children is that they actually, despite so much chaos and violence and confusion and things going on in the world, are actually able to be in the present moment and can draw us into the present moment with them. And so I tried to make sure to find time to do that with her as often as possible. And I would encourage all of you to do the same, whether it be grandchildren, children in your community, family members, because children are literally joy personified. They are also aggravation personified at times too, as you can see. But that's also just the yin and yang of life, right? That's the flow of it. So that's what I've been trying to do. I know it's not particularly profound, but it's the truth.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I'll jump in. This is it's a really profound moment that we're in our society. And one of the things that really strikes me is how many organizations and employers and leaders have been reaching out asking what they can be doing. I mean, I might probably the wrong person to be asking, but they're also asking about what resources can they plug into to start doing this work. And, I saw a comment pop up saying white voices matter in this. And what gives me incredible hope is that there is a sea of white faces marching with Black faces out at every protest. And there seems to be a willingness within mainstream white organizations to start listening and start doing some work. And, there's always the reality that some organizations just want to check the box and say, well, we did this. But there seems to be a sincere desire for introspection and some work. And I mean, right now we have this tiny ember within the white community that we need to, gently blow on to make it a flame. And the opportunity is there. And one of the things within my own priority is how do I equip myself and my team at ADL to be the best voices we can be to start having the conversations in white space. Because ultimately, our voices are going to have to be what helps uplift the Black voices calling for change. And like I said at the beginning, I'm still learning and I have a long way to go. But I think the presence of white allies and the community that's forming in that space is unlike what's been in place before. And I think if anything gives me hope is that the Black community is not going at this alone.
Thank you.
Well, I've been sitting here trying to figure out how to word this. I think really what I'm a big believer that there's really nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And what I see a lot, and it's really giving me a lot of hope, because I believe that, Juneteenth, the day of Jubilee for, our ancestors is a day of happiness. It's a day of exaltation. And for me, I've always known a lot of anti-racist white people, but watching a lot of these anti-racist white people I know shift from being allies to really being accomplices. that they're getting involved. They're getting involved in their local politics. They're getting involved in activism, and they're being very vocal. Because what makes white allies and accomplices so important is they have access to the rooms that are completely built to drown out Black voices. And seeing, and I was a history teacher for a number of years, but seeing so many of the students I taught in high school just being very vocal, and they're all adults now, being very vocal about how they are anti-racist and they are done trying to rationalize and explain this away. To me, it makes me feel that I feel confident in saying that I believe that we will win. I believe that we will win. And it may take time. I may not live to see these systems completely collapse. But looking at all these institutions, and I'll close with this, even if you think that the billion-dollar companies and all these other institutions saying Black Lives Matter and taking the steps they have is completely cynical and it's completely a profit-driven thing. What that says, though, is that these huge entities see where the force of history is, and they have no interest in being on the wrong side of it. And this may be symbolic, but never underestimate the power of the symbolic. The symbolic reinforces the ideology that creates the institutions, that creates the systemic conditions. So what I see now is this really people pushing back on racism on all levels, systemic, institutional, interpersonal. And this is the most activity I've seen in my 37 years. And a lot of it's anger, but to quote Larry Kramer, who recently passed, anger is a wonderful emotion, if you know how to use it right, you know how to channel it. And what I'm seeing is a lot of people channeling it, that righteous anger into unapologetic, really unapologetic righteousness. They want to be on the right side of history. They want to help, and they want to see their Black brothers and sisters not suffer. So to me, what gives me joy is that right now, Black Lives Matter is not so much a political movement, it's a cultural force. It is a movement in American culture. And you can stop a political movement. You cannot stop a cultural force, especially when its time has come. And I think its time has come. And that fills me with a lot of joy on this day of Jubilee.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick. So as we close out today's discussion, I want to thank each of our guests on behalf of Xavier and the Center. Thank you for the work that you're each doing and all of the heavy lifting. You all are doing some heavy lifting, and we thank you for it. If you would like to contact the panelists, I will put up their contact information at the end of today's webinar. Feel free to reach out to them or to me with more questions, thoughts, and ideas. Please also allow me to thank Karen Blair, our program coordinator for the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit. Karen keeps everything together behind the scenes, including me. And I also want to thank Yamlak, who is Xavier's IT guru. I leave this conversation hopeful. I am hopeful about the hope that's finding its expression in the streets. And I recognize, though, that hope isn't a strategy, right? It is a condition of the soul, but it is not a strategy. And to transform our condition will take collective action. It'll take collective struggle and an awareness of the insidiousness of capitalist, atomistic individualism. While history writes moments of societal transformation as heroic individualism, in truth, our accomplishments in progressive struggles are always a result of the collective. Our focus to end racism, to end anti-Blackness, to end discrimination, to end poverty, to end over-incarceration, to end the militarism of police, and to solidify the US freedom movement must be accomplished by a community of struggle who recognizes their agential power. This, I think, is what the ancestors knew so well, that the only way out is through, and through together. Be well, be community, remember our shared humanity, be of good courage. Thank you, and have a wonderful Juneteenth. Thank you all. Have a great day.